Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Thriving on Campus Pride webinar series. My name is Simon Coulombe. I'm an associate professor at Laval University, and I'm part of the Thriving on Campus research team who is organizing this Pride webinar series. We want to really thank you, everyone. Thank you, folks, for being here with us today as part of this second webinar, as part of this three webinar series. We are really happy to have you with us today and to have wonderful presenters who will share important insights regarding inclusion and well-being for LGBTQ2S plus students. And I use the pronoun he and him. And before getting to present to you a little bit more about the plan of the webinar today, I would like to introduce you to Tin Vo, who is a postdoctoral researcher at University of Toronto and who is also part of our research team. Tin today will help me facilitate and moderate the discussion session, but I want first to ask Tin to do a land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Simone. So the land acknowledgement that I'll do will focus on Wilfrid Laurier University, where who's mainly hosting this webinar. So Laurier's campuses are located on the shared traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And this land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect our resources, and not to engage in conflict. And this territory is described as 6 miles deep from each side of the Grand River, starting at Lake Erie and extending to the proportion and into the head of this river, which it supports, it is supposed to support posterity that is enjoyed for these communities. And despite the largest reserve demographically in Canada, those nations now reside on less than 5% of the original territory promised to them. For myself, as a refugee, I remain a visitor to these lands, and I have benefited from Canada's history of colonization. And the call for reconciliation is really important even to this day, because many Indigenous communities still face inequities, violence, and oppression. And while June is Pride Month, it is also National Indigenous History Month. And so it's important for us to recognize and celebrate the deep history, heritage, resilience, and diversity of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities across Canada, in addition to our history of colonization and genocide. And I am graciously thankful for the Indigenous peoples who have been stewards of Turtle Island for time immemorial. And today, as we meet across Turtle Island, please take a moment to acknowledge the land on which you live and work, and consider how you might be contributing to Indigenous reconciliation.
Thank you, Tin. Thank you for reminding us to take a moment to do our own territorial land acknowledgement wherever we are located right now. Thanks. So just before we get started with more detail about the different presentations we will have today, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So first, just a reminder that the webinar is recorded. Also, regarding questions and answers, there's going to be a Q&A period at the end of the overall webinar and also after each presentation. During the presentations, please enter your questions directly in the Zoom screen. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A tool icon. So you click on that icon and you should be able to type your answers, and we'll make sure to ask as many as we could to the speakers. Also, we have enabled live transcription, closed captioning. To get this activated or enabled, click on closed caption to start viewing the closed captioning. So that's it for the more general housekeeping. I just want to remind you that this webinar series is based on a recent special issue of the Journal of LGBTQ that we contributed to. It's really a collective effort. Here you see the editorial team, but there are lots of other authors, researchers, and practitioners who have contributed to this special issue. If you want to see some of the papers of the special issue, there's a QR code. There's a QR code that you can use at the bottom of this slide. Maybe I can give you 1 second in case you want to take a screenshot of the QR code. Thank you. So today's presentation, today we are lucky to have wonderful folks with us. We're going to talk about important topics regarding LGBTQ2S+ inclusion on campus and more broadly about youth. So the first presentation will be by Christina, Arayata and Vanessa Vigneswaramoorthy. They will present the presentation. They don't owe you their history, conceptualizing racialized queer care through protective spaces. After their 20-minute presentation, approximately, we will have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Then the next presentation is going to be Queer and Trans Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, the Son of LGBTQ+ Rainbow by Trun Nguyen. The presentation will also be 20 minutes. It will be followed by a 10-minute approximately period for Q&A. And then we'll have a shared Q&A that will be moderated by Tin. And we will have a conclusion and a wrap-up. So without further ado, just before that, I can also instruct you or indicate to you that if you want to know more about our Pride webinar series, we invite you to download the webinar program. It includes more information about the speakers and the different presentation. In the interest of time, we will not read each of the speakers' bio today, but there's more information in this program. So, without no further delay, it's really my pleasure to invite. Before that, sorry, I just want to remind you again that if you want to ask questions, use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So without further ado, I just want to give the stage to our first presenters. So I want to welcome to the virtual stage Christina Arayata and Vanessa Vigneswaramoorthy, who are gonna present to us on racialized queer care through protective spaces. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and I wish you a good presentation.
Is everyone able to? Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, and thank you for inviting us to share our work. As mentioned, Christina and I will be discussing our conceptualization of racialized queer care through protective spaces. So a little bit about us. Christina and I have different research interests, but we are both interested in race scholarship, queer scholarship, and conceptualizations of care. This work is also inspired by our time in a student union as undergraduates. It was here that we began to see the tensions in terms of accessing holistic care for racialized queer students, especially those who have disclosed to either of us that they were selectively open about their queerness in order to protect themselves against discrimination within their racialized communities. Our conceptualization of protected spaces is limited by our experiences with sexual diversity rather than gender. This work and our conceptualization of protected space is emergent, and we are working on an understanding on how this concept can help serve a variety of different intersecting identities. This kind of research cannot be done in a silo, and if it resonates with you and you're interested in reaching out, please feel free to. Our agenda for today is as follows. First, we will be discussing the theoretical frameworks on which we base our conceptualization. Then we will be discussing the concerns of racialized queer students in 2S LGBTQ and/or racialized counterspaces. And then we will be going through our idea of protective space and how it can be implemented for practitioners.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa, for getting us started. As Vanessa mentioned, my name is Christina. And to get us situated in understanding our conceptualization of protective space, as well as the experiences of racialized queer students, it's important that we ground ourselves in the following frameworks. So here we have A Love Politic by Hooks, Centrifugal Intersectionality by Cho and other authors, and Whiteness as Phenomenological as seen by Ahmed. Through using these frameworks, we're able to see how racialization, queerness, and whiteness overlap and exist in competition with one another. A Love Politic expands our capacity to provide life-giving spaces by allowing us to decenter and move beyond the self, to identify how systems of power decenter ourselves, and move beyond the self to identify how systems of power and domination work to oppress others. This allows one to turn away from self-centered longing for change, which can contribute to performative action. Centrifugal intersectionality builds on Crenshaw's original work from 1991. Cho and other authors, including Crenshaw herself, introduced the concept of centrifugal intersectionality to allow the use of the concept to be adapted within the researcher's context of interest, which in Vanessa and I's case is racialized queer students and navigating counter spaces at the university. This approach has allowed us to keep race at the center, as race cannot be unwound from other structures of domination, while also examining how heteronormativity, homonormativity, and whiteness work together. Whiteness as phenomenological is understood by seeing what is within proximity of whiteness itself, and this means that whiteness influences our experiences and our reality. And this can be best summarized through the following two statements. Whiteness is what lags behind, which causes the normalization of white bodies, leaving them to go unnoticed or not othered, as racialized bodies are. This understanding of whiteness helps us to explain how the racialized body, and more particularly the racialized queer body, is within constant visibility and constant othering. On the other hand, whiteness also shapes institutional decision-making by shaping institutional spaces themselves. So this can be seen in policymaking, governance structures, and even policy implementation, just as a few examples. So now that we have a baseline understanding of these theoretical concepts, Vanessa can walk us through the racialized queer student experience and higher education counterspaces.
So historically, 2S LGBTQ plus spaces promote a homogenous 2S LGBTQ plus identity through the erasure of race and a prioritization of white homonormativity, wherein the white male body is normalized in 2S LGBTQ plus spaces. This quote-unquote colorblind approach erases racialized queer visibility. In racialized spaces, on the other hand, the prioritization of respectability politics pushes racialized students to act as a quote-unquote respectable racialized person, encouraging the adoption of white heteronormative ideals. The racialized queer body is thus seen as strange, a product of Western influence, and/or a detriment to racialized progress. We wanted to note that the term respectability politics is a term that originated within Black scholarship, but we're coming from an understanding that these politics are found in most racialized communities, found within a white heteronormative society. We still wanted to honor the origin of that term. Since racialization is more visible and immediate and is shared with lifelong racial, family, and social communities, racialized queer students tend not to disclose their queer identities to avoid losing these vital lifelines. Some students may take on leadership to address these issues, forcing themselves to be highly visible and take on extra labor. Both scenarios are linked to increased feelings of stress and negative impacts on safety and belonging. With that, we would like to bring in our conceptualization of protective space.
So our conceptualization of protective space expands on the Rosestone's collective reconceptualization of safe spaces, which many of us may be familiar with already. But what makes this reconceptualization possible is this idea that true safety is impossible to achieve, as ideas of safe and unsafe are contextual, dependent, and fluid. Protective spaces builds off of this understanding of safety, as it requires those who wish to use this in their practice to understand and navigate how safe and unsafe are fluid, as well as the nuance of the presence of intersecting forms of power and domination within a given program, service center, etc. This allows practitioners to begin to build a protective space both reactively and proactively. This involves the two following main concepts: moving forward or away from guilt in order to move towards meaningful action, accountability, and community, which we'll expand later on in this section. The concept of protective space is a description of the space that is achieved through the action of protection, as protective is a trait that is achieved by using this following framework. For racialized queer students, regardless of their visibility, creating a protective space does not only mean naming a space or for a program just for racialized queer student programming, as an example. Rather, it requires naming or marking a space as counter to both heteronormative and homonormative whiteness. This allows racialized queer students to maintain control over how they wish to share, express, or disclose their queer identity, allowing them to access queer care without necessarily having to disclose in order to access the space. To help understand what using this framework may look like in practice, we can turn to the following example.
The following scenario is based on incidents we witnessed in our student union positions, and we would like to use them to highlight both the need for protective space and suggest ways of implementing it. This example takes place in a racialized counterspace. A racialized queer student expressed discomfort to staff around a queerphobic comment made by another attendee in discussion circles. In response, staff reminded attendants of the equity statement of the university. The student anonymously shared their concerns with a student leader who later shared this feedback with staff. Staff became defensive, reiterating that their work was aligned with the equity statement and that the student was free to speak with staff directly if they were concerned. The racialized queer student chose not to return because they felt alienated by the lack of staff response, confirming their anxiety towards how their concerns may be dismissed.
So as we mentioned before, building a protective space involves moving forward or away from guilt. To move forward or away from guilt is not to negate the experiences or identities of practitioners and staff who share some or all of the identities with the students that they serve, as whiteness, race, heteronormativity, and homonormativity affect their experiences as well. Rather, it calls for both minoritized staff and those from dominant groups to acknowledge feelings of discomfort and when mistakes happen, and recognize how running to protect oneself may indirectly protect the larger fabric of the university in certain circumstances or contexts. This can lead to solutions that are rooted in individualism and paternalism. So what does it mean to move forward from guilt? It means going above and beyond just identifying and naming guilt and discomfort. It also means reflecting on why this feeling arose, who or what is being protected by immediately addressing one's feelings of guilt and discomfort. How are these feelings being addressed through actions or inactions when situations arise? And whether or not the action or inaction that we take reinforces digestible ideas of diversity by doing what is right in accordance to the institution, rather than centering the needs for safety and belonging of the students or student that we are seeking to assist. Oh.
Beyond moving forward from guilt, protective space requires practitioners to take action and accountability while building community. Protective space is a collaborative effort between different actors, and action with accountability is just as strong as our collective understanding of community. It calls on practitioners to remember who they are accountable to and act in alignment with the needs named and identified by said community that they are serving. In this case, it is the racialized queer students that the practitioners are accountable to, and it is their concerns that must be centered. We encourage practitioners to ask the following questions. What is done to avoid this issue in the future? Now that there's a recognition of queerphobia in the space, the practitioners can take steps to combat the issue. How is the space as it is contributing to the issue? Consider the impacts of respectability politics, a lack of racialized queer visibility, etc. And what kind of space is it aiming to be? Spaces that are catering to racialized students or queer students should also strive to be safe or safer for racialized queer students. Roles in action and community are dependent on an individual's respective positionality. As mentioned, protective space is a collaborative effort.
So now that we have a baseline understanding of what it means to build protective spaces or what a protective space is, let's look back at the following scenario that Vanessa shared with us. The yellow numbered highlights are there to help us visually see where we can apply our conception of protective spaces to help navigate service building and space management. So while there was an attempt to address the incident as seen in the first highlight, this can be considered a form of an action. This is because there was a lack of direct acknowledgement from the harm caused to the student, which in turn prioritizes the feelings of the institution. As the use of EDI statements, according to Ahmed, aims to shift our perceptions of the existence of whiteness or domination within the university to be seen as more progressive than in reality. This reinforces the idea of digestible diversity, where diversity within an institution values which is what is already valued, which in this case, in a racialized space, is heteronormativity. By pointing back to institutional commitments and redirecting the student towards the staff member who dismissed their issues during programming, undue labor in rectifying the situation was placed back in the hands of the student rather than having a collaborative approach in rectifying the situation where the student feels protected and connected. This helps protect the institution from appearing less progressive than desired, as the onus is then shifted back, especially as the staff's response was to highlight that they were doing right by the institution. Here, the solution points to the staff remaining accountable to the institution rather than the student who is seeking care. This in turn erases the experiences of the student who feels unsafe, leading them to not return or access further programming or potential community from this particular student service space or program.
Applying protective space requires a reactive and proactive approach. In a reactive approach, staff could have been asked when the student initially brought up the concern, what needed to be done for the student to feel safe and seen if it was possible to make those changes. In this way, the response would not be in alignment with the institutional requirements of diversity, but in alignment with the needs of the student. It also gives agency and power to the student. Staff would then reflect on their own personal feelings of defensiveness or guilt. This ensures that undue labor is not put on the student to address the issue themselves, and the staff is able to move towards taking action to address the problem. In a proactive approach, recognizing an issue with queerphobia, the staff could develop measures to avoid similar situations in the future, such as creating codes of conduct or developing a process to bring up concerns. In an ideal setting, other participants would know that queerphobia is not accepted in the space before even sitting down. There's also a move to normalize racialized queerness in the space. This may be done through efforts of collaborative programming to develop collaborative programming between racialized and 2S LGBTQ plus counter spaces and or programming that addresses the concerns of racialized queer students that also seeks to educate non-racialized queer students. An example we used in our paper is a joint film screening. Films such as My Beautiful Laundrette or Paris is Burning can help normalize racialized queer visibility, and racialized queer students are able to be in the space without having to declare which quote-unquote side of the room they are on. Film discussion afterwards can provide a space for racialized queer students to share their feelings if they are comfortable, and can also serve to educate potential allies for the students through the facilitation of discussion. This can be done in accordance with existing programming, such as a screening during Pride Month or as part of a block of Black History Month programming. This is something that we are beginning to expand on. So again, if you're interested in this conceptualization, please reach out. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. If you are interested, you can scan this QR code for a hyperlink to our article, our contact information, and a works cited for this presentation where all articles with a DOI are hyperlinked. And thank you again, and we will open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, folks, for this great presentation. I will invite now Tin to facilitate the discussion, and feel free all to ask questions through the Q&A tool. But Tin, I'll let you facilitate this.
Great. Thanks, Christina and Vanessa. That was a really insightful presentation, and this conceptual framework is really interesting approach to thinking about protective spaces. I'm really just chatting now as I wait to see if any Q&A questions come through. Maybe I'll start with a question in thinking about like what is an effective or meaningful approach to training staff around protective spaces, especially in thinking about like ensuring that they don't get too defensive in their approach to as challenges arise and are brought up to.
I can go ahead and try to answer this, and then Vanessa, feel free to hop in. I think coming from my own personal experiences, even trying to create service provision, like I'm not perfect in my allyship. I'm also not perfect in serving my own communities. And a big part of that is the practice of having to decenter yourself in your own experiences. Just because I experience one thing in one way doesn't necessarily mean that another person is experiencing something another. I know that there are competing studies about the effectiveness of EDI training, especially in higher education spaces. But I think it really is a community approach. I've noticed more recently, we try to take a punitive approach to things. There are times and circumstances where we need to meet people where they're at in order to understand, and it is this issue of communication. And I think that was also the struggle Vanessa and I had in writing this article, was to try to get down to the more emotional pieces of it, because I think at the end of the day, through our experiences too, it has been very much an emotional response out of people. And that also stems from a culture that can be very isolating and very much focused and practiced on very quantitative performance goals of how many bums in seats, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if that necessarily answers the question. I think there's more complexity in that I can keep talking about. But I think that ties into this idea too that we're trying to expand on, of this difference between proactive and reactive approaches in building protective spaces.
Yeah. Sort of adding on to that, it's I think it really should be hammered home in these kind of spaces that defensiveness or guilt is what's keeping people from sort of taking action to create something new. When you're kind of sitting centered in your own concerns or your own defensiveness, then you're not taking the action necessary to make it a safer.
I think
I think there's we lost part of the last the sound for the last answer, right?
Oh, sorry, did it?
Yeah, just your final sentence kind of cut out. You were talking about defensiveness.
Hope we didn't lose her.
I think another piece, though, as you were chatting, Christina and Vanessa, is the inclusion of those reflection questions might be a useful tool and reminder for folks to, as part of their own training and response. I see you're back, Vanessa.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I think there's a question here, if you can maybe explain the proactive approach a little bit more.
Yeah, so with the proactive approach, it's a recognition, it kind of comes in tandem with the reactive approach. So with the reactive approach, you're responding directly to the incident. With a proactive approach, you're making sure that the incident doesn't happen again. And of course, we can never like perfectly create a safe space, but we can try and make it safer. So in the example that we use, the idea is in the moment to react and protect the needs of the individual student and also avoid feeling defensiveness or guilt or putting undue labor onto that student. But when it comes to the conception of the proactive space or proactive approach, the idea is then to make sure that it's understood with all participants and everyone in the space that the queerphobia is not allowed. So, or is not going to be tolerated or is going to be dealt with immediately. And so it's this idea of now that we recognize that there is a behavior or a attitude or something in the space that is impacting the safety of racialized queer students, then what can we do to make sure that this issue does not happen again in the future?
Thank you. And there's another question here from someone at the Yellow House Student Center for Equity and Inclusion at Queen's University. So they serve QTBIPOC students, and they're hoping to see if you had an insight on physical space or decorations that support a protective space that allows for students to feel comfortable, whether they're LGBTQ or BIPOC or both.
So we don't touch on like physical markers in the space. There's a ton of literature about it already. But I think I could answer this more so with my experience being a student union executive, which is again where Vanessa and I met. And it was through reflecting actually on the spaces that we built collaboratively or individually, where we're like, oh, like these are practices that we've naturally done, and we tried to write about it. And I think I don't, it's always helpful to have, you know, positive space stickers up, rainbow stickers up, even just visualizations of different racialized folks and different visualizations of what queerness can look like in a lot of the intersections of racialization and queerness. Racialized bodies are hindered, invisible, and othered within queer spaces because it's almost as if these identities are incompatible due to choices that individuals make in order to preserve their cultural identity. For example, growing your hair out long or choosing to wear traditional clothes may be tagging you as less progressive when that's not necessarily the case. In terms of the spaces I built, I don't even think that I made it in particular to, or consciously to make it welcoming for a targeted audience, but I think it was more so of how comfortable the space was. Did the space look sterile? I just had a bunch of like different posters of things that I enjoyed and that other students enjoyed in my office space, having necessities that they may need just open and out for people to ask. So that was snacks or pamphlets or resources, having door open policies. And once you build it, students will come. I think that was the one thing I also learned as well. And I don't know, Vanessa, if you can talk about that more.
Yeah. Sort of speaking with the similar experiences that I had, I think it's just as important to have those spaces of comfort, but also to have spaces in which entering the space does not feel like disclosure. So we were able to sort of build spaces in which the areas were for queer students and allies, or racialized students and like racialized students, but then there was a feeling of queer safety in those rooms. And because of that, we were able to sort of create spaces where entering a space did not require disclosure. Entering a space could just be, I want to hang out with my friend who happens to be queer, and maybe I'm queer, but maybe I'm not. That kind of sort of ability of choice over disclosure was really important. So those comfort spaces are great because if you make the queer space if you make the queer space also a space that's comfortable and does not require disclosure to enter, that's a very vital part of protective space. Another thing that I will point out, and this was a experience that we had attending a university that was mostly BIPOC at the time, is look at the posters in the space. Look at what if you have a lending library, see what books are available, see what kind of films do you screen, what kind of who even in for your sort of event posters, what bodies are on the posters. That is, I think, a vital part, because if you are a racialized queer student and you look at a poster and no one on the poster looks like you or even vaguely like you, that becomes a feeling of, well, maybe this space isn't for me. So it is A, that sort of creating a comfortable space, but B, also making sure that the racialized queerness is as normalized in the space as other forms of queerness.
Thank you. I think another question that just came in might be related to this, and see if you maybe have something to add, but how do you deal with pushback from racialized folks who are queerphobic?
That's very contextual. I think it depends on the situation. I think in student programming, it's really calling people in and identifying what harm is caused in the space. I think sometimes we're so careful to be gentle, and sometimes our gentleness can be mistaken for dismissiveness. And there are times where there needs to be a hard line in saying that this behavior is not okay. I know that that can be difficult for some service providers, depending on their own positionalities. There have been many situations where it was probably unsafe for me to say anything. But that also means coming up with a plan with your co-presenter or colleagues in order to call out that kind of resistance in a way where you're also protected. That was one strategy I've used quite a bit. But also, like, it's really that piece of education. Sometimes it is also asking people why they thought that comment was appropriate, and seeing what was going on. I think it looks different on a systematic level, where not only are you facing interpersonal politics, but then you're facing institutional systems, institutional politics, and then sometimes your hands are tied, especially as at least we've been seeing kind of this weird separation and decline of funding and support for EDI centers, and the rise of anti-intellectualism and whatever that means. So I think the challenges are becoming increasingly complex, and I think that calls us to really be more collaborative in our approaches in providing service provision, or even counter programming to what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of a big thing. The education part is, I think, the biggest part, but also creating those spaces in which it's understood from the get-go that the queer phobia is not going to be allowed, or is not going to be tolerated, or is going to be called out. I think that is also a vital part of that.
There's another question here. It looks like the person is coming from the US, but I think might also be relevant in Canada with certain provinces as well, considering legislation. But how would the current climate in certain states hinder or help these kinds of efforts if protective spaces or DEI efforts are being challenged?
That is a very complicated question. I think the main thing to remember is that this is a community-centered approach, and it is based on sort of building of community and building of support systems. So in these spaces, the idea generally is that we are trying to remove, or at least decrease, the idea of what the institution is defining as enough diversity or enough equity or enough inclusion, and instead look and build community and have a community-based approach to what safety and belonging is, and how to create sort of protection. And I think that is kind of like the main idea behind it. It's not necessarily it is not necessarily an idea of creating more diversity or inclusion, but instead it is protecting the people who may fall under the sort of umbrella of not heteronormative white. Um, yeah, it is. So I think protective space is kind of like a good response to that. It is no longer relying on the state or institutions to define how we're going to deal with DEI efforts or how we're going to deal with anti-oppressive efforts or anti-oppressive practices, but instead building our own and creating community that hopefully in the rise of increased discrimination and violence against queer and racialized folks that is sort of already building these support systems of protection.
I have to stop us here. These are very, very interesting discussion, insightful reflection. Thank you so much, Tin, but also Christina and Vanessa for your participation. This was a great, great presentation. Thank you, and great question period. Before we go into the next presenter for today, I just want to inform you, and you may have realized that earlier when I presented the session plan for today, that two of the presenters that were supposed to be presenting their work today regarding housing, student housing, for example, two of these presenters could not attend today, finally, due to circumstances beyond our control. So we're really sorry that they could not attend. But so today we're going to have only two presentation, but the good news though is that it provides us with more time to have a longer question period, a longer period of the question at the end. So, and if you are interested in the work from the folks who could not attend today, their work has been published in the spatial issue that I mentioned earlier with the QR code. So you're invited to go see their work there. Okay, so now it's the time for our second presentation. So I will invite Trun Nguyen, who will present to us on queer and trans Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The presentation has the subtitle, The Son of LGBTQ+. So thank you so much, Trung. The stage is all yours, but the screen is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can hear me, right? Okay. Yes. Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Trun Nguyen. I'm currently a PhD student at an institution in the US, and also is a graduate student employee who sometimes teaches classes and some terms will be graduate student mentors for the undergraduate student staff at the initiative, on-campus initiative that I'm going to introduce. My presentation titled as such, and it's also the same name with the article that's been published in the special issue on Journal of LGBT Youth. So I invited you to read that co-authored report article on the special issue, but today I'll make it a little bit more interesting, so not to bore you with the same information, is that half of this time allotted for me today, I will briefly go through what we wrote about in the report, and the other half I will unfold what has been happening this past academic years. As we write and submit articles and approve and whatnot, time move on and new incidents happen. So I want to update you with, what's currently happened this past year with the initiative. So I hope that it would keep you interested. So the reason why we the pun in the title, the son of the LGBTQ plus rainbow, is because there's no rainbow without the sun, right? And that's also the roots of this name, Seoul, which is a play on word for meaning, it's in Spanish, it means sun, but also it's a play on word for soul food, in the African American community. And it is an initiative, and I'll go to the history of Seoul to explain further why, we have this initiative, but it is an initiative created to uplift students who are at an intersections of queer and queer, trans, and, the racialized identity, just like what Vanessa and Christina, presentation. So it adds an intersections of queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and POC identities. In our report, we think that Seoul is a practical model for other college who committed to DEI to apply to uplift the lives of students with multiple marginalized identities who are often neglected on campus and who would benefit from additional research within the field of higher education. So the history of Seoul come from activism. And I'm really inspired by this because the person who, started this whole initiative since 2004 was also a graduate student. Daron Coles is a Black graduate student, founded Seoul as an organization that allows students to embrace all parts of their racialized gender and sexuality identities when students are searching for on-campus community. And then, when you read the article, you see that it actually met with a lot of obstacles, and it was first funded by a supportive faculty, and then later on until now it is now being funded by students' money, right, from the students' body government. Yeah, and the main theoretical tenets of Seoul is intersectionality, by Kimberly Crenshaw, in which she sort of based it on the court cases of Black women who are at the intersections of both being Black and being woman and being discriminated against. So it's technically and makes an argument for folks who at intersections of multiple marginalized identity, and the more marginalized identity you are in many contexts, you became more targeted and more harmed in these intersections of marginalized identities. Here the number of students of color as well as the number of LGBTQ plus students seeking resources and services has grown, because as me and my co-author, who are both staff of Seoul, I'm the graduate student mentor in some terms. We have data about like the rise in numbers of students' participation on campus at Seoul. Still students from the growing populations when coming to Seoul still express that they continue to experience a lack of sense of belonging at this institution, which, I didn't want to have my institution on my, screen, but it's being shared anyhow. To me, I think, in a way, I'm kind of like anti-institution. So, but at this institution, so this means for a need to Seoul to create more inclusive space and and the impact of Seoul on campus needs to be more emphasized and bolstered. The goals of Seoul is to create a sense of community and belonging for QTBIPOC students, both the students who are student staff and also the QTBIPOC students who comes to Seoul. Second, support the holistic well-being of QTBIPOC students, helps QTBIPOC students to feel empowered, strengthen relationship between plus community and the POC organizations. So what do I mean by other cultural centers that focuses on POC communities? So at this institution, there are 7, what we call cultural resource centers, and 6 of these are, one of them is the Pride Center, and 6 of the others are the centers that's centralized on advocacy and community building for each of the respective, racialized community on campus. Like there's one APCC, like the Asian Pacific Cultural Center. There's one Native American Cultural Center. There's a Black Cultural Center, and they all have their own specific names. And then there's the Pride Center and the Woman and Gender Center. The design factors, so it's student fee funded initiative designed to focus on holistic well-being of QTBIPOC students. And then it is, again, as a part of the Department of Diversity and Cultural Engagement. Yeah. So the 2 main theoretical tenets that Seoul is built on is intersectionality, as introduced earlier, and interdependence, proposed by Adrienne Marie Brown. Interdependence, a concept defined by Brown's in their Emerging Strategies book, is defined as a mutual reliance and shared leadership, vision, which is where technically what it means is that the directors, the leadership of these different 7 cultural centers, cultural resource centers, and Seoul as an initiative will collaborate with each other to help each other create programmings and events and staff training that are that creates this kind of interdependent relationship, as well as collaborative efforts to have events that are not just pigeonhole each of these centers separately. So that's why in their tenets, interdependence and intersectionality are the 2 key theoretical frameworks. For example, 1 year or so, student worked with the Kakuix Manaina House students to create, which is the Native American Cultural Resource Center, to create an event on Indigenous and Two-Spirits experiences, while other students, created events. Like last year, there was an event that collaborate between, especially in February, there's always an event that highlight the Black queer students' experience that Seoul usually collaborate with the Black cultural centers on campus. Impacts, you can read more. See time. For impacts, you can read more in the report. Like there's a lot of positive impacts. Specifically, I want to mention the Seoul Flea Market that garner like 200, 300 students, and it's happened every spring term, where the different art makers, we prioritize QTBIPOC students who are art makers and who create arts to have a flea market to sell their stuff on campus, and it's garnered a lot of attention on campus. Okay, so this is new, especially with this past year, since many current events unfold on campuses across global campuses, with the different encampments on different campuses. A lot of things had happened, and by briefly look at my screen, you can already guess, what I'm going to present, which is I want to talk about the institutional co-optation and betrayals on these tenets that they promised the students in Seoul, right? the full-time leadership team of this institution, DAI groups, I think go back on their words and committed a lot of harmful thing that I kind of see resonate a little bit with the earlier presentation. First, they threaten students who express different opinions on the direction of Seoul, even though the tenets, the spirits of Seoul was that it should be led by students because it's created by students' activism, right? So it should focus on the direction that the undergraduate students, staff at this initiative proposed. And then which led to an unfolding of several events like micromanaging, job termination threats, treat student staff differently, especially single out like trans student of color. In our report, it's very important to notice that this is the focus, of different the focus of our initiative, which is to protect the most marginalized students, which are queer and trans students of color, right? But a debacle. So vocal trans students of color are most at risk because of constant bullying, and then use institutional power to suppress students' activism, especially after this whole, student activism on, campus encampment. And then lastly, they also adopt divide and conquer tactics. Like they would, treat different students differently, and then they use tactics to divide between the students within this group, which is kind of a shame because you all are adults and you are doing these tactics on these undergraduate students. And then institutional using corporate move, right? Like I said, force fire 3 student activists who are trans of color, silencing student activism with corporate style meeting, create several meetings and then cancel last minutes. And then lastly, calling cops on queer and trans student of color during AAPI month and Pride Month in the US. And, I do want to emphasize the cop came straight from the on-campus student encampment. So the meaning of all these intersectional systems of oppression becomes even more highlighted, even more heightened, right? So how do we get here? I think from the roots of Seoul as a student, as an initiative that came from student activism, it is and the whole ideas of intersectionality and interdependence is a really great models for college across campuses in North America, not only in North America, but in the global South where I came from. And I think these are really nice and essential to create essential space for queer students of color. However, we should also think about the co-optation, the institutional co-optations that works like that's many authors who work on critical university studies has discussed, right? So we need to consider how to not step into that direction that is currently happened and unfolded this past year. And I do want to say these Seoul governing, these Seoul leadership are men of color, and then two white queer women, and it looks and it's visually very phenotypically very very progressive, but how do you practice the coalitional politics that really is the title of let's say Asian American coalitional politics, or queer and trans politics, and not just because you are a POC or a queer person that you practice these necessary transformative coalitional politics, right? But yeah, I think lastly, I want to emphasize what should we do to not get here despite all the great efforts and the building up of all these years of activisms and contribution on campus. It is to really think again your role, and since when you as a leadership team becoming a part of the institution instead of standing up and support the students that actually you are being hired to support. And actually you being hired because of them, because they created this space from the get-go. Yeah, thank you. So these are my personal information. Please reach out if you have questions, or if you want to, express disagreement, I guess, or certain things. But yeah, it's like my little presentation, and hopefully it does not bore you with, reading my article in the special issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trung. Thanks. It was not boring at all. It was great. And thanks. Very, very insightful information. Tin, the stage is yours for for facilitating the question period.
Great. Thank you so much, Trung, for that presentation. And as I sort of wait for questions to come through, I'm curious if you have any recommendations or lessons learned around how folks at other institutions might address institutional oppression of activism on campus.
At this moment, like, I'm very we go through different emotional phases at this moment, because these recent past events has been like really fresh. So I'm kind of like in this distrust of institution at this point, because I'm a PhD student. I have 2 master's degrees, and across different humanities field, I've sat in several meetings, and there's like all these great proposal academically, all these talk, and I've seen the people who committed these harm at these talk too. So there's can many things that I can share. But at the end of the day, it's like, I think it's really self-reflection to really sit down and think about the work, the readings, the theoretical books that you read, the tenets that you created, and really think, am I really practicing what I'm preaching, or am I just another, I don't know what word, but you know what I mean? So there's a lot of great works already and cited in my report. And I also saw a lot of great work that, cited in like the previous, thank you, Vanessa and Christina. So you can read more on that, you can discuss more on that. But at the end of the day, you have to really understand the positionality of these arguments, of these authors, of the theoretical frameworks, and you practice it. Of course, there's still a lot of like institutional hindrance. And whenever I share this, people are like, oh, you don't know the behind the scenes, like a lot of things that we have to do. And like, girl, I know. I know I've worked, several jobs, and I know how it works, right? But at the end of the day, you still need to hold your theoretical values at some level, so that you could support. There are ways, okay? So I just think those are excuses that sometimes people who stay so long in the let's say DEI can't forget, or at least the one that's at this institution. Yeah.
Thank you for that response. So this person in the chat has sort of stated here, they've heard a recent pioneer in the field of Black studies say that we might not be seeing the changes we hope for in the academy because we don't identify as part of the institution. And they've added or asked here, do you think it's possible for administrators with activist roots to progress further in systemic change if they actually start identifying as part of the institution, and therefore challenging the institution to enact the values they're only presently performing instead of embodying?
Sorry, I'm a little bit dyslexic, so that's a really long worded question. So let me take some time to process it. With activists, progress further. I think that's one route. That's one route to like start for administrator with activist roots to start identifying as a part of the institution, therefore challenging. Yeah, that's a tempting proposal. For me, I am, for me, like, at least at this current research stage, like I read more of like authors who identify more with the politics of refusal, of disidentifying with the institution. So because and I think they made a great case for like not for because like by disidentifying and refusing to see that you are a part of the institution, you then it's like a constant reminder for your politics as well as your actual practices to support these students, and using institutional let's say loopholes to support these students when there are institutional barrier, right? But from the attendee who proposed this question, I guess it's possible. I don't know. I from my experience, at least from my reading and research, at least, it's the other way. But I guess if you have more experience and share actually like a real like experience with identifying as part of the institution, you can share more. Thank you.
Another person has asked here, how do community organizations and support networks impact the lives of QTBIPOC? And then there's a follow-up question of, did you introduce any external support systems to Seoul?
How do community organizations support networks impact the lives individuals? Community organization support networks. Oh yeah, I think it's since I've been here 2 years at this institution, I think the necessity for Seoul is really felt on campus, right? Especially when these undergraduate student staff go way beyond their $15 or whatnot per hour part-time job time, a lot of time to really go into their respective community and advocate for events and programming that could really help their communities. So has created a lot of like invited talks and art practicing spaces for a community who are QTBIPOC to came and get to know these activists and also create arts with them. So it's I think it's really felt and it was an inspiration for them to keep pushing and despite everything and going forward. So I think introduce any external support system to Seoul. What do you mean by that? External support systems to Seoul? I guess what you mean was like I was just guessing. So if you're asking if Seoul did reach out to other supportive faculty who knows about the history of Seoul and to garner their support during these trying times, yes, they do. Like these undergraduate student activists are really on their game. Like they reach out to supportive faculties, supportive staff on campus to advocate for them. Also for the events that they created, that they proposed. I want to emphasize that all these events are proposed by the student staff, right? For those events, they also reach out to relevant general area of the where the campus is on. There's like different organization like supporting trans students, of color, mental health resources. There's like various community organization that they do reach out to have these collaboration. So they do think about community at large and not just the on campus, the students community. But again, the goal is still for students on campus, but for events and activities, they do reach out to other organizations. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Trung. The final piece is just a comment that thanking you for sharing your experiences and recognizing that this experience is common as states push back against DEI programming, and that you've reminded them that they're not alone.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Trung and Tin. I would like now to ask Vanessa and Christina to come back on the call. Thank you for a general Q&A discussion. Then you can moderate or facilitate the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. As we see if any other comments come through, but there were some questions that were still lingering from your earlier presentation, Christina and Vanessa. So someone here has asked, I'm curious what advice you might have for those of us in the US who are facing statewide bans and how your research might be difficult to implement given state pressures.
Yeah, so I think just coming from a Canadian context, that makes me very, very unqualified to answer the question because I don't understand the intricacies of state violence, of even the bureaucratic systems there. I have a very overhead understanding of it, very deeply rooted in my Ontario context. But I think even just on a foundational level, finding your allies, finding people within the space who are willing to support you, that makes a huge, huge difference in being able to provide like effective service provision. I think it's also this idea as well, like we talk about this idea of moving away or forward from guilt, and part of that is not just this feeling of guilt. It was just the easiest way to describe this phenomenon or this feeling that we've noticed even in our own practice, but essentially like this discomfort is part of that is identifying it. I lost my train of thought, but I was going somewhere with that.
I can try and bounce off of what you were saying.
If
Again, I am also very rooted in my Ontario context, but one thing that I will say is given sort of those pressures, we're all sort of limited by what our positionalities are and what kind of power that we have. And the sort of thing that I would encourage folks in the States doing, because I've seen it being done here in Canada, at least, as unfortunately there has also been a rise of queer and trans, anti-queer and trans violence in Ontario and in Canada in general. There were a few anti-2S LGBTQ plus protests, I believe last fall, and unfortunately that movement is still going. So it is spreading, unfortunately. But with that understanding and sort of understanding that the institutionalized supports for these are being taken away or being disenfranchised, I think the biggest thing is that remembering that it's a community-centered approach, and even if within your positionality you're not able to implement it within the institutional space or create those spaces, I think even just creating these small moments of support in whatever capacity that you can is vital, because once those community supports are built, then you build the support structures that are necessary. So one of the things that we talk about is not just creating a space that's comfortable, but also educating potential allies so that when the student is not in your physical space, whether it's a community center or a racialized student center or anything like that, even when they're not in that physical space, they have allies with other students. And it is about sort of detaching from looking at what is possible within the realms of the university, and then instead looking at what is possible in these small moments of what you are capable of doing. Because once enough sort of staff members or practitioners are able to sort of build these small moments of protective space, that builds together a larger protective space within the campus environment.
Thanks, Vanessa. Trung, I wonder if you might have some thoughts to add here, reactions as you're from the US as well, and thinking about DEI initiatives like Soul and how, how we might sort of push back against some of these challenges.
Some of these institutional challenges, you mean, Dr. Ba? Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
so wait,
Um,
go ahead.
yeah, I think what I see, and I agree with Vanessa, is that you really need to center around like community work. And that's what these students staff has been doing, right? And at least in the 2 years that I'm here, right? um, you have to see like what and what and they should be the driving force, um, because a lot of them are a part of the community on campus, and a lot of them came to work at Seoul because they want to create meaningful, meaningful interactions and activism on campus, right? So I think again, like, you really need to center the students, right? Student center approach. I'm sorry, coming from a TESOL background, right? You need to really center your students, and protect them, because you has power. People like, oh, I'm being pushed back by my, big bosses or whatnot. We know that, but at what point do you, and what can you do with your position in the hierarchy to support these students in various ways? They're in, either it's implied, or there are ways to go around things, to go about things, um, and or at least to have conversation with these students to discuss why and how you what you're struggling with, and the balancing between institution and their needs, and you really need to lay it out instead of like just pushing them down from like the hierarchical top-down approach that the corporates does, and my key argument in my earlier presentation is that you are adopting a lot of corporate moves. And I'm, as someone who also came from a corporate world and then changed later in my life, I'm triggered because all of these move is the corporate move, like that I shared earlier. So yeah, I think you really need to center a student.
Thank you. Just to remind our attendees that you're welcome to submit questions for both presentations. I believe this is for our first presentation. How would you recommend is a good way to navigate competing interests in the use of spaces, such as multi-faith spaces, or even ongoing issue of encampments in universities, making certain folks feel unsafe because of the perceived illegal nature of these encampments?
I can start it off. And so when it comes to the encampments, I think a lot of the, well, at least like at what I've seen at the U of T encampment, I'm not quite familiar with the ones at other universities, but I think those encampments are already protecting, are within themselves, are already practicing a form of protective space. For example, for those unfamiliar at the U of T encampment, the first night when police were sent to tear down the encampment, Toronto community members basically surrounded it so that police could not get through. They are offering multiple, the organizers are offering multiple ways to support, and they've been trying to reach the needs of students as they individually come up. For example, sourcing food from the community, creating libraries, creating spaces for medical tents and things like that. And so with that, there is this idea that it's centering the needs of the students that are in the encampment and also the students who are outside the encampment who want to support, and giving them multiple ways to support. It's creating spaces wherein they're reacting to what they've seen at other encampments and developing solutions that avoid that sort of work to avoid or work to combat the issue before it even comes up. And it also, so within those encampments, I think there is an example of protected space. And when it comes to sort of people seeing it as sort of feeling illegal or unsafe, I think we have to sort of rethink what we think of as safe. And a lot of that comes from educating people about what the kids in the encampment are doing and the work that they're doing to keep things safe and their practices. I think so much of that feeling of being unsafe is administration fear-mongering. And I think that's an extremely dangerous route to go. So again, it's education. It's letting people know, well, have you seen the reading library that they have? Have you seen the religious services that they have? At least at I'm again not familiar with other encampments, but at the U of T at the U of T encampment, I've seen religious services. I've seen community members coming and bringing food and supplies and medical equipment. And I think that is kind of a form of protective space. And again, from the outside, I think with the way that the administration has been treating these encampments, it looks unsafe. And again, the idea is education, educating people about the encampments, making sure that there's no misinformation. And yeah, and then when it comes especially to like multi-faith spaces or sort of competing interests in the use of space, it's again looking at the students and what they need and prioritizing what they need. So a huge part about this again is that source of collaboration. So in a multi-faith center or a racialized student center or a TOS LGBTQ center, are communities coming together to build something that's in between both of them. So for example, if there is a need for a queer Muslim programming, are we finding resources to make that like programming available, or are we building connections between two different groups in order to build it? And of course, it's not always going to work. It's not always going to be possible, but it's the effort of trying, because once you try, you're given the ability to sort of say, well, okay, this thing is possible, or this is not possible. So maybe my solution is instead to provide resources for students that are centered on queer Muslim needs. That's like another option. So yeah, it's a lot of trial and error and building community with other organizations, and then also just working to highlight the misinformation that might be found.
I just also want to add that it goes back to this idea too of like the intersectionality, the love politic, the centrifugalness of it all, and how whiteness is inherently phenomenological, because it does change how we view certain bodies as othered or as violent. That's also very important to highlight, and also how we are in ourselves entrenched in that, because when we identify what power we have, as Trung and Vanessa were saying, we're able to leverage what resources we have as well that were actually given to us by the institution. As a student union leader, back in the day, I had so much more power in being able to say what I needed to say, because I knew what kinds of institutional benefits I had. My role has significantly shifted now because I just hold the title of a doctoral student. Student codes of conduct are very much an interesting thing that could be slapped on you in some cases. So there's that shift in power and privilege in those ways. And then there's also this idea where I think the individual Christian was talking about how universities make folk feel unsafe, certain folk feel unsafe. Again, it goes back to this idea of centrifugal intersectionality and who's being centered at that conversation and what is being protected when we mark certain bodies as unsafe to a space, or unsafe to whom. Vanessa and I were talking about this a little bit as well, this idea of violent versus violence. When acts are seen as violent, or when acts are seen as violence, or an incident becomes violent, where, looking at the encampments at the Palestine liberation circles, these are peaceful protests. The narrative of violent or unsafe, or, what is legal or illegal, comes from the institution, comes from the state, and it's only then that these events become violent, where they're seen as disrupting a norm. So it's important to recognize that and to name that and to identify that in order to then unwind this idea of misinformation. Just because it gets so tangled up in feelings and, you know, personal politics and identity, like we need to start moving beyond that in terms of allyship. Like it's not enough to be racialized. It's not enough to be queer, to just stand in a space and say that you know things now at this point. And I think this idea of protective spaces really urges us to move forward from that with really critical self-reflection as well, because the work comes from us. The work isn't possible without the bodies doing the labor, unfortunately.
Thank you for this thoughtful response. Someone has provided this comment here about wanting to know more about provinces or news sources out of Canada as a way for coalition building, but this might have come in at an earlier conversation. So whoever made this comment, if you can provide a little bit more specificity, and maybe Christina and Vanessa, you can respond through the chat. There's a final question here. Did your research explore the effect of spaces and events restricted to specific demographic groups on campus? And do you have an experience or advice in defending these spaces and events which might face backlash from administration and students? And how can we create more of these intersectional spaces for racialized queer students?
Yeah, so just to clarify, our work is very conceptual. It's based off of our personal experiences as student leaders, and the time Vanessa and I spent apart, like we're friends, obviously, but the time Vanessa and I spent apart professionally, we collated a bunch of various intersecting experiences. And so we used a theoretical synthesis to come up with this, which is why a good chunk of our presentation was based off of those 3 theoretical frameworks, as they heavily inform our idea of protective space, or what it even means to enact that. In terms of personal experience, I think Vanessa and I have a good chunk of experiences doing that, of having to face backlash from administration and students in creating more intersectional spaces. I think one of our favorite comments from back when we were more public facing in our student union roles was that some of our programming was racist to white folk. And again, it is that conversation and idea of why is this happening? What kind of education is going on? What kind of narratives are happening? And sometimes, at least with the power and position and where Vanessa and I were at the time, it just means just doing the event, just doing the programming. Like, students are going to need it no matter what. People are going to be unhappy no matter what. People are going to have to say what they have to say. But at the end of the day, the reason why we're doing it is because students need this space, and the pushback is very evident as to why students need this space. I think there is more complexity as narratives, again, of what is safe and unsafe, and which bodies are seen as legal or illegal or violent or non-violent, are getting more complicated, and these narratives and language are being used and pushed and pulled against us. And I think that all comes down to communication as well. I think in this space, we're speaking at a very high level because we're all very familiar with the topics that we're talking about. But in practice, it needs to look a lot different. Like, sometimes it means putting our egos aside and what we've learned and read in terms of theory and practice, and really just getting down in the dirt and in the level of where people are understanding or where people are feeling. I come back to feeling because at least recently now I've noticed too, even within my own circles, it's become like a feeling issue, like an ego issue. So I think that's just a broad stroke of it all. I don't know if you have anything to add, Vanessa.
Yeah, just again, based on personal experience, I think one of the biggest thing, sort of the last part of your question about facing backlash and from administration and students, and sort of creating these intersectional spaces, is use the spaces that already exist. So it's a question of, if you have a racialized student center or a 2S LGBTQ center, or a space that's meant for a certain group, are all facets of intersecting identity safe in that space? So again, if you have a racialized student center, is it a space in which a queer racialized person can walk in and feel comfortable? Is it, if you have a 2S LGBTQ plus center, is it a space where a racialized a queer student can enter and feel comfortable. And if the answer is no, then I think that there needs to be an effort to make it a little bit more comfortable and make it sort of and normalize it. And sort of without that normalization of racialized queerness, it's never going to shift. Like so much of having students feel comfortable is normalization and making sure that students are able to sort of enter both spaces without having to like really worry about not only disclosure, but also like discrimination. Like, are they going to have to worry about having to deal with queerphobia, or are they going to have to worry about dealing with racism when they enter a certain space? And if the answer is yes, then efforts have to be made to create those moments of normalization, and that's how you make an intersectional space. And again, the reason why we suggest collaboration is because so many times these identities are siloed within different centers or within different resources. And through that collaboration, through joint programming, or even through sort of sharing each other's resources, that's how we develop these really important and vital like connections and very important and vital sort of ideas of what it's going to look like to create intersectional spaces. So the reasons exist, it's just how we're putting them in place.
Thank you so much. There's just two comments left in there. Just the first is saying how they love the approach to challenging privilege and questioning what it means to feel unsafe. So this is a really great perspective. And then another statement, it's easy to forget that pride came from activists and also protesting for rights to live. So I'll just, with that, thank you, Christina, Vanessa, and Trung for your wonderful insights, and I'll hand it back to Simone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Very interesting, important discussion to remind us of like the importance of considering the intersectionality of like different identities and different queer and other spaces during the Pride month and throughout the year. Definitely important stuff and very interesting discussion. Thank you so much for your time again, and Tin, also thank you for facilitating the discussion. Before we let you all go back to your daily lives, daily activities, I just want to remind you that this was part of the Pride webinar series. This was the second of 3 webinars. The third one is happening next week on June 11th. If you want to look into the program to know a little bit more about our wonderful speakers like Vanessa, Christina, Trung, and others, here's the QR code for the programs. If you want to attend, and you're really encourage you to attend the webinar on June 11th. This is the lineup that we have of presentation on that day on different topics regarding queer crip identities, belonging, visibility, and peer inclusion, the question of misgendering also, and mental health, for example. So these are just examples and a quick overview of different topics. You're invited to join us. If you have not registered yet for the third webinar, you can also use simply the same link as today's link to attend the webinar on June 11th. I just want to see that there's a question. Yeah, there's a recording happening of the presentation. We will let you know how to access the recording in the next few weeks. Actually, Michael Woodford, who's the lead researcher on the group, is actually answering the question from the person who asked the question about the slide. Again, I just want to thank you for attending. Thank you to the presenter, the organizers, for example, Michael, but also the larger team, Eric. Sorry, it keeps going to the last slide. I just want to thank the supporters and funders, so Shirk,
laureate with Victoria University, the Center for Leading Research in Education, and the Center for the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative Fund. Thank you so much. And again, thank you all. I wish you a happy Pride Month. Hope to see you on June 11 for the last webinar. Thanks again for your time, for your attention, and I wish you a happy end of the day. See you soon.